Latinos are expected to be the largest minority bloc this election. They could help determine the outcome of the presidential race, particularly in key states, including Texas, where they make up 30% of the eligible voters. Professor Sharon Navarro with the Department of Political Science at UTSA joins us now to talk about the power of the Latino vote. Dr. Navarro, how is the Hispanic vote impacting the races right here in Bexar County?
We still have a slight support for Joe Biden and trailing Donald Trump.
Well, the polling in battleground states has shown Mr. Biden leading President Trump among Hispanic voters, but not in every case. And even in Florida, it showed Trump ahead, and rarely by the same margin that Mrs. Clinton commanded in 2016. Why is Biden not doing as well as Clinton?
The criticism on the Biden campaign is that they started to reach out to Latinos fairly late. And the polling has been a little confusing for Latinos. There was a lack of recognition of generational differences as well as gender differences.
Well, in order to win Texas, Biden has to outperform Clinton here among Latinos. She won 61% of the vote. Will he be able to do that?
Biden is doing better in some of the counties than we had expected. In Harris County, he's polling well above than expected, and Donald Trump is sort of trailing. But it's still early in the night, and the election is not over until the last vote is counted.
Well, the Latino vote is not a monolithic vote. I mean, it is split along generational lines. I mean, what party has a future with the Hispanic vote?
It depends on the party that reaches out to them. The Latinos will support a candidate that speaks to them. And what we see in this election is Donald Trump spoke to the Latino communities, particularly the males, stating that he was strong on economics and he had a way out of this pandemic. And Latinos are a type of community that is picked up by your bootstraps and moving forward in a very tough economy.
All right, Dr. Navarro, thank you for joining us.